Making more money is supposed to calm you down. That's the story everyone expects, because more income should mean more margin, more room to breathe, fewer consequences attached to ordinary decisions. Yet for many people, the opposite happens, and they notice it quietly at first, in the way choices start to feel heavier instead of lighter, in the way attention sharpens around what could go wrong rather than what's finally secure. On paper, things are better, safer, more stable than they've ever been, yet internally something tightens, as if the ground beneath you is thinner now, not stronger. And that contradiction doesn't make sense until you realize this isn't about math, it's about what your system believes it's responsible for protecting. The moment income increases, the stakes feel higher, not because you're actually at risk, but because there's now something to lose that didn't exist before. And that awareness changes how you move, how you decide, how carefully you monitor yourself. What should feel like relief starts to feel like pressure because the margin you thought you gained begins to feel like a narrow edge you could fall from, and the calm you expected never arrives. Instead, your mind tracks outcomes more closely, your body stays alert longer, and financial progress starts to feel strangely fragile, as if stability itself requires constant vigilance. Nothing has gone wrong yet, but the tension is already there, sitting underneath success, because something inside you doesn't experience more money as safety, it experiences it as exposure. And that discomfort is the first sign that financial progress and psychological safety are not the same system. What makes this confusing is that it doesn't come from the present, it comes from earlier environments where having more meant being watched more closely, where improvement didn't equal ease, it increased scrutiny, expectation, and consequence. And the system learned to treat upward movement as something that attracts pressure rather than dissolves it. In households where money was unstable or emotionally charged, doing better often came with unspoken tension because progress raised questions of whether it could be sustained, whether it would provoke resentment, whether it would be taken away. In those environments, doing better didn't teach your system to relax, it taught it to brace, to prepare for correction or reversal, because stability never felt guaranteed. It felt temporary, something you had to hold tightly or it would slip. The lesson wasn't that money creates safety, it's that money increases responsibility, visibility, and consequence. So growth became something to manage carefully rather than enjoy. And that association hardens over time into a rule your body follows automatically. By the time income rises in adult life, the original context is gone, but the conditioning remains. So financial growth triggers old expectations, not of relief, but of pressure, because the system learned early that having more didn't mean being safer, it meant being responsible for holding something fragile. What locks this in place isn't logic, it's the nervous system, because once money becomes tied to safety, the body doesn't experience increases as neutral upgrades, it experiences them as larger loads to protect. When income rises, the nervous system doesn't register more buffer, it registers more responsibility, more potential loss, more exposure to error, and that shifts the system into heightened monitoring rather than ease. Instead of settling, the body stays alert, tracking risk more closely, scanning decisions more carefully, because the stakes feel higher now, not lower, and what should be extra margin becomes extra surveillance. This is why financial progress can bring constant low-level tension, a sense that you're carrying something that could be damaged, because the system believes losing ground from a higher position would be more damaging than never reaching it at all, and that belief turns preservation into the main job. Loss aversion intensifies here because preserving gains feels more urgent than enjoying them, so control takes priority over ease, restraint over confidence, caution over expansion. This heightened state doesn't feel like fear, it feels like responsibility, like maturity, like being careful with what you've earned. But underneath, it's the same survival logic that learned early on that progress attracts pressure. Until the nervous system updates its definition of safety, more money doesn't widen the margin, it narrows attention, keeping the system vigilant, not because danger is present, but because the cost of loss now feels intolerable. Where this pressure deepens is at the level of identity, because the version of you that learned to survive without much doesn't automatically trust the version of you that now has more. That earlier identity learned discipline, caution, and restraint as protective traits, ways of staying intact when margins were thin and mistakes carried outsized consequences. And those traits didn't disappear when income increased. They became embedded, almost moral. As money grows, a conflict emerges between who you are becoming and who you are trained to be loyal to, because expansion threatens the coherence of an identity built around carefulness and endurance. Having more begins to feel like stepping outside the rules that once kept you safe, and asserting ease, confidence, or relaxation can register internally as arrogance or recklessness, not because you believe those judgments rationally, but because your identity learned that vigilance equals virtue. This is how financial growth starts to feel morally loaded, because part of you equates restraint with being good and ease with being careless. So comfort reads like risk, ease reads like complacency, and confidence reads like tempting fate. Even as your external situation improves, your internal allegiance remains anchored to a version of yourself that believes safety comes from control, not expansion, and that loyalty quietly resists recalibration. At this stage, the pattern becomes mechanical because the same psychological forces that once governed scarcity now reattach themselves to growth. Loss aversion intensifies rather than fade because preserving gains feels more urgent than avoiding losses ever did, so the system treats decisions as threats to stability rather than steps towards ease. Present bias reinforces this because the immediate discomfort of potential loss outweighs the reassurance of long-term safety, keeping attention glued to what could go wrong right now. Money dysmorphia plays a central role because your internal sense of fragility fails to update at the same pace as income, leaving the body reacting as if the margin is still thin, even when it isn't. Guilt conditioning weaves through the response because ease can feel undeserved, as if relaxing vigilance means disrespecting the effort it took to get here. Neural pathways strengthen with repetition, so each time you double-check, hesitate, or constrain yourself after progress, the circuit becomes more efficient, teaching the brain that heightened control is the correct response to growth. Identity-based income ceilings quietly recalibrate upward, not by allowing relief, but by redefining safe at a higher level of tension. So the system keeps you operating at the edge of responsibility rather than letting stability feel settled. These mechanisms ensure more money doesn't translate to more safety, it translates to more pressure because the system is optimized to protect what exists, not to experience relief once protection is no longer required. Once these mechanisms lock together, financial growth doesn't stabilize the system, it raises the internal threshold for what feels safe, so the pressure compounds instead of dissolving. Each increase in income recalibrates responsibility upward, teaching the nervous system that the new level must be maintained, protected, and monitored, which means vigilance becomes the baseline rather than the exception, and ease starts to feel like neglect. Decisions that once felt simple now feel consequential because the system treats deviation as potential slide backward, and the fear of falling from a higher position carries more weight than the memory of how far you've already come. Over time, this creates a paradox where progress generates tension, tension reinforces control, and control becomes proof that you're being responsible. So the more careful you become, the more necessary that care appears, even when nothing is threatened. External stability no longer registers as permission to soften because the internal rule has shifted from surviving scarcity to defending position, and defending position requires constant alertness. As the loop repeats, financial growth stops feeling like movement and starts feeling like a plateau you must guard, where any misstep could undo everything, even though the original risk conditions no longer exist. The unsettling part isn't that more money fails to calm you down, it's that the nervous system responsible for keeping you safe never learned how to stand down. So even as income rises and risk objectively decreases, your nervous system continues to behave as if stability is temporary and must be protected at all costs, leaving you with the question of whether the tension you carry is actually protection or simply evidence that your body still doesn't trust that this stability is allowed to last.